This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
The Rosenzweig house was situated diagonally across the street from a curious structure, a bit of an architectural monstrosity. It was called the Klondike Ramp, circa 1905, a spiral ramp supported on concrete piers. It stood 64 feet in height. Each level provided 7 feet of clearance. The concrete walkway was pitched at a grade of almost 8% to accommodate foot traffic, bicycles, and kids racing wagons. There were 7 complete turns on the structure, which connected the 11th Ward neighborhoods high above to Broadway below. Observing it for the first time, a visitor might describe it as a huge, inverted flour sifter without a hand crank. The alternative to accessing those neighborhoods above was a notoriously steep hill, known for multiple accidents and injuries, especially in the winter. Schenectady's 11th Ward included Strong and Summit Streets, along with Hamilton Hill, once famous for its speakeasies and tenor saxmen like Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins when they were passing through town. Unfortunately, the ramp was constructed next to an unstable clay hill prone to landslides and littered with trash deposited from the back porches of homes on Strong and Summit Streets. Heavy rainfall over the years saturated the soil, eventually causing a landslide that demolished a gas station at the bottom of the hill. But at the time, the ramp served an almost singular purpose. It provided a useful covered passage for the workers to travel to and from the GE plant below. Each day, a steady stream of employees would descend the ramp, lunch pails in hand. At the bottom of the incline was a viaduct that deposited them onto Broadway, a short walk to their jobs. After their shifts ended, the workers would ascend the ramp to get home. They would pass the Rosenzweig house every day, streams of them in various conditions of well-being and mood, endlessly making their way to and from the GE facility. Some of the workers who traversed the Klondike Ramp referred to it as the 7 heavens because of the 7 levels of ramps. There was a strong Catholic presence in the town that held to the beliefs they'd been raised by, the Jewish and Christian cosmologies, the concept of the 7 heavens, and the Pauline arts, though they might not have recognized or understood those terms. Stories circulated that a few of the folks who regularly made their way through the ramps experienced indescribable feelings, strange passions, or had sightings of a sort they could hardly explain or describe. But given the day-to-day hardships, the necessity of making a living, the drudgery and repetitive work at the plant, little thought was given to it. It was passed off as fatigue or just anomalies. Some of it was attributed to the frequent stops on the way home at the sanctuary, a dive bar convenient to the ramp's entrance, which featured a shot and a beer for 75 cents. The Klondike Ramp, a.k.a. the 7 Heavens, also had a reputation for trouble. It could be dangerous. Groups of teenagers sometimes harassed and robbed unsuspecting travelers. Homeless men would urinate in the ramps. Occasionally, perverts were hauled out by the police for soliciting sex. It was not a good place to be after dark. Ivan Rosenzweig had decreed from the time they moved into the neighborhood that his children would stay out of the place. It was not a playground, though some of the local kids, unsupervised by their full-time working parents, would race their bikes down the ramp, often with disastrous consequences like broken legs and cracked skulls. Ivan's rule was enough to tempt his daughter Devora to explore the peculiar structure and its various levels. She was drawn to it. The story she heard intrigued her. It became a challenge to foray into the ramp and return home without Ivan discovering her disobedience. She'd visited multiple times before she began to realize that the place was somehow affecting her. She would experience things there that would open her up, change her in ways she would not have expected, though she might never fully comprehend what they meant. She sensed that it was much more than just a passageway for laborers to tread. It was a gateway to other worlds. At the end of spring, summer burst upon the town with a blast of heat, as if the GE plant had opened its massive doors and allowed the turbines to release their discharge into the air. Devora had just taken a cool shower and returned to her room to dress. She had a full day at the garage, where she was scheduled to replace a clutch on an Oldsmobile with almost 80,000 miles on it. Ben wouldn't let any of the other mechanics attempt it. One of them, Leroy, would assist Devora, but she was in charge of the job. Leroy was Big Daddy Flanagan's nephew, and she was especially fond of him. She made it a point to teach him everything she knew for when she'd finally get out. She wanted for him to have a solid job as a mechanic. He was a talented kid and played the alto sax in his uncle's band. She had convinced Ben to hire him. He was reluctant at first. Prejudice cut both ways. They had a heated discussion about hiring Leroy until Devora reminded Ben where they had come from and why they had to leave. With Leroy helping, the job went smoothly. He stood nearby and knew exactly which tool to hand her as he cleaned up fluid spills and moved the lamp around so she could see well. They chatted while they worked, which Leroy seemed to enjoy very much. Almost none of the white women in the neighborhood would talk to a black man. Devora thought that was silly. Worse than that, it could lead to what was happening in Poland. She asked him about his childhood. He'd grown up in the neighborhood singing in the Living Truth Tabernacle and learning to read music as he studied the alto sax. Big Daddy Flanagan had been the choral conductor and also the organist. "So you know this neighborhood well?" "Oh, like the back of my hand." "Have you ever gone up there?" She tilted her head to the left to indicate the ramp. "Oh, you mean up there? The Seven Heavens?" She stopped working and lowered her wrench. "You call it the Seven Heavens?" "Everybody knows that. My Aunt Grace says she saw the Lord up there sitting on his throne." Devora was shocked. "She did?" "Sure she did. She sees God everywhere. Saw the Virgin Mary in her jello. Then she ate it." Devora tried not to react and began working on the car again. "Give me the 3/4 inch, please." He already had it in his hand, reaching out to her. Devora entered the ramp entrance at noon, just as the whistle sounded at the plant. It was already 85 degrees, but it felt cooler in the shaded structure. She made her way up deliberately, acutely aware of any sounds or people who might be ahead of or behind her. There was a humming sound. Depending on how much wind there was and what velocity it was blowing at, there were often different pitched tones in the structure. Thus far, she had not seen anyone up to the 5th and 6th levels. Then she made the turn into the 7th incline and thought she heard music, but it seemed to be coming from below. She leaned over the railing and peered down and saw a good-humor ice cream truck. It was the source of the music, but not the usual tinny song it played, recorded from a calliope. It sounded familiar, like something she'd heard many years ago. There were strings accompanying the song, which was not what you'd hear from an ice cream truck. Suddenly the words came to her, "Oifen Perpetuik," a sorrowful Yiddish song she'd heard in her childhood in Samud. It had to do with giving someone, usually a child, a menorah, and the idea of maintaining the light of the Torah study. The song caught in her throat and chest, and she began to cry. She cried for her father Ivan, for what he'd endured. She cried for her murdered brother Josh, and she cried for her homeland, which she would never see again. How could anyone, the perpetrators or the victims, ever look each other in the eye again? She cried for Rudy also, realizing that she was perhaps someone who could never marry, never give up her independence. She had tasted freedom in the new world, and she hungered for more of it. And all of it. What had brought her to this moment, about to enter the highest level, the seventh heaven, and see for herself if God was there on his throne, flanked by angels? What could happen to her if she were to see such an awesome sight? She entered the seventh level and walked to the top. There was garbage strewn around, empty soup cans, crumpled bags, crusts of bread from sandwiches that had been discarded, and it smelled of urine. She concluded that perhaps a group of hobos had spent the previous night there. There was nothing sacred or holy about the place. In some way she felt relieved. What she'd already seen in the place had upended her life, changed her permanently, and she had no one to share it with. She began her descent as the intensity of the music increased, now with a woman's soprano singing the heartbreaking melody. No longer in the distance, the music surrounded her. Devorah began to tear up again. When she got to the fifth level, she saw two vagrants rounding the curve. One carried a crutch, and the other looked as though he carried a book under his arm. She assumed that they were part of the hobo group, returning to look for scraps or a place to relieve themselves. When she was within 10 feet of them, they stopped and waited for her to approach, which frightened her. They stood apart so she would have to pass between them. "What do you want?" she screamed. The one with the crutch, she suddenly realized, was instead carrying a staff with a carved head on top, possibly a lion or panther with garnets set in the eyes. The same staff that the vagrant had with him on the bus when she and Sarah returned from Albany. It was the same fierce man in the burlap robe and sandals. He was wearing a necklace, a thick silver chain with a perfectly rounded peridot the size of a walnut. It glowed with a greenish sheen and rotated like a miniature planet. There was no choice but to pass between them. She attempted to do that, but stopped involuntarily. Her legs weren't weak, but she couldn't move. She willed herself to move forward, but she couldn't. The man faced her and removed the necklace and held it out to her. Slowly, without thought, she raised her hand and pressed her ring against the necklace. The two stones touched, creating a spark that ignited into a greenish-blue flame, which gave off heat without burning her hand. Suddenly she was overcome with feelings of grief and sorrow, deeper and more intense than she'd ever experienced before. It was profound and shocking. She understood in that moment she was suffering the loss of millions, the deprivation, the torture, millions gone into the flames, her people and the others caught in the murderous web of the Third Reich. Only people without souls could perpetrate such crimes. She wept uncontrollably for the dead, the mothers, the fathers, the children. The other vagrant touched her arm gently. She turned and looked into a deeply lined face, the face of the black Hebrew Egyptian prince. not the white-faced lie that had been handed down for centuries. His crinkled beard disappeared into his robe. He slid the blue sapphire stone tablet from under his arm and took her hand gently and placed it upon it. She traced the tablet with her fingertips. She could feel the words carved into it, and she could hear the words, "Honor thy father and mother." He released her hand, and a swirling feeling came over her, as if she were being drawn up into the air. The men backed away from her to either side of the railing. She stood equidistant between them, overcome with emotion. Then she became aware of an intense blue light. She looked about for the source of it and realized it was coming from herself. Rather, the men were projecting the light onto her from their chests, specifically from their hearts. She looked down at her torso and legs and saw that the light was entering her body. She was taking it in. It looked watery and reminded her of when she'd studied amoebas with a microscope. Her sorrow began to dissipate, and she felt herself overtaken by an unimaginable sense of reverence, of love for her family and all the families that had perished. There was a brief disturbance like sheet lightning. She looked up, and the men, the prophets, were gone. The music stopped with a final loud chord that startled her. She staggered to the railing and leaned over, gulping in humid air. She thought, "I am changed." She ran through the neighborhood. She had to find Ivan. She entered the synagogue, quickly covering her head. Instead of going directly up to the balcony, she disobeyed the mechitza law that men and women should be separated, and went straight to the main floor of the sanctuary and stood beside him. The other men, bent in prayer, made audible gasps and moved away from her. They stared disapprovingly. "You are not supposed to be here," Ivan whispered. "Papa, I belong here as much as any of them," she said, referring to the affronted crowd that had gathered in the aisle. "I came to pray with you." She pressed on and said the prayers and recitations with as much authority as any of them, and in flawless Hebrew that astonished Ivan. He hadn't realized that she had retained so much. The men had stopped davening, and the sanctuary became silent except for one voice. The rabbi turned to see where the female voice was coming from. Devorah finished the prayer and waited in silence. The rabbi's eyes widened. He spoke to the men in a hushed voice and then retreated to an anteroom where the worshippers followed him. Ivan and Devorah remained seated. She noticed a tremor in his hands, his veins pulsating as he grasped the bench before him. His jaw was clenched. This was not what she'd intended. She had infuriated him. Finally, he stood up and exited abruptly. She followed him for a few blocks, afraid to approach him. He stopped at Erie Boulevard and waited for the cars to pass, the late afternoon traffic, competitive and impatient. She caught up and stood beside him. He stood erect and unapproachable, his bird-like head movements glancing left to right at the traffic, waiting for a safe moment. He must have been livid with her. When it was time to cross the wide street, she felt something touch her hand. It was his. He'd taken hold of her hand, as he had when she was a little girl, walking with him home from shul. Without looking at her, he continued to hold her hand firmly, but not too firm, as they walked back to the house. And in those moments, her heart filled. He had accepted her finally, as his child, his equal adult child. a gesture, an embrace with just a hand that would last her for a lifetime.
That was The House of the Seven Heavens, written and read by Mark Morganstern. This story is an excerpt from the book The House of the Seven Heavens and Other Stories by Mark Morganstern, Recital Publishing, 2022.
Welcome back to the Strange Recital, Mark. I think it's been about 6 or 7 months.
I think so. Thank you. Good to be back.
Now, in your last visit, we featured an excerpt from A Factotum in the Land of Palms, the final novella in your new collection. But this time we featured an excerpt from the novella that gives the book its title, The House of the Seven Heavens. The excerpt you read explains the Seven Heavens. But why did you decide to make that story the title story of the collection?
Well, in some ways I feel like it's the strongest piece in the collection, and I was so drawn to it and into it while I was writing it. I guess it spoke to me.
Okay, tell us a little more about what happens to Devora and the rest of the novella.
Devora, who's also been an avid journalist, has been writing since she was a little girl, and she continues doing that in her upstate town, and eventually realizes that that cannot be her home. And she eventually makes it to New York City and reconnects with a childhood friend that she met when they came through Ellis Island. And she winds up living on the Upper West Side, and she gets a job waitressing in a jazz club. And she meets a young, talented guitarist, etc.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that this story was written for and about your mother. That raises the question of that blurry region between non-fiction and fiction. They overlap, they interweave. And I suspect this is true for most fiction writers. Do you have any particular approach to how you address that mix?
I don't, but I absolutely agree with you. I wrote this story to give my mother a life she wasn't allowed to have, given the orthodoxy and the strong-willed father and everything about it and where she came from. And I just wanted to offer her something that she wasn't offered when she was here.
So I guess something similar is true for the other stories in the collection. The 3 short stories in the middle plus the final novella. They're all grounded to one degree or another in a sort of everyday reality. But then there are visionary moments, strange events, hallucinatory passages, a sort of American magical realism. When Paul Auster was challenged about his use of coincidence in fiction, that it's supposedly unrealistic, he said he sees himself as a realist. He wants to write fiction as strange as the world he lives in. So do you see reality as magical?
I think I do. I think when you talk to people long enough, even people you don't know well, things will come up in the conversation that might seem strange or things that might not have happened. But yeah, I think we all experience these things. I think something else is happening and it does affect us.
In addition to your sometimes humorous ventures outside normal reality, I've also noted a distinct kind-heartedness in your work. People are forgiven for their mistakes and weaknesses. Compassion for other humans underlies your stories. Would you call yourself a humanist?
Maybe more so someone who would like to be forgiven.
Well, Mark, I know you've always got new writing in the works. Can you tell us about the latest?
Yeah, I'm working over a group of one-act plays that I have rewritten a while ago and looking towards getting them produced, hopefully in our local theater in the fall, if I'm lucky enough.
Have you been tempted by the new AI tools like ChatGPT? Imagine how prolific you could suddenly be. Just write a good prompt.
And could we, as your publishers, tell the difference?
Yes, to that. You guys don't miss a trick. I read about the new bot thing. Someone played one for me. They said, ask it anything. I said, okay, compare Jesus Christ to Austin Powers. And the first sentence is, well, they're both charismatic figures. But I won't be consulting it for writing. I don't ever believe it's going to develop a human heart into it, whatever it is.
Yeah, I read of one long-standing literary journal who actually closed down because they saw the future. No way to know the authenticity of anything anymore.
Yeah, the next couple of years should be very interesting. For now, you can find more information about the House of the Seven Heavens at recitalpublishing.com. It's available wherever books are sold. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thank you.
Yes, and we'll have you on again. Just keep writing, not prompting.
Thank you very much.
Brent, have you tried ChatGPT?
No, I've decided not to sleep with the enemy.
What strikes me is that humans have been around for about 300,000 years. We've been quite a successful species in an evolutionary sense, and it's only now that we need AI. But I don't think it sleeps with anyone yet. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Chosen Kale Mazeltov by the _Orchestra. This is episode 23061.